Good morning. Welcome, everyone, to the first of three special panels for the Center for Security and Politics at the Goldman School of Public Policy in conjunction with SIGA. Today, we're hosting three panels on three different aspects of elections and election security. I'm Janet Napolitano. I'm a professor of public policy at the Goldman School and the head of the Center for Security and Politics. The first panel will be moderated by Professor Susan Hyde, and it will discuss some comparative examples from other countries. The second, which I will moderate, will be a panel with state elected officials who were on the front lines during last November's election. And finally, the third panel, to be moderated by Dean Henry Brady of the Goldman School, will focus on some of the more technical aspects that can improve election integrity. Each panel will have a Q&A session, and you're invited to participate in one, two, or three of these important discussions. So now, without further ado, let me introduce Professor Susan Hyde, who is a professor of political science, SIGA affiliate, and the interim co-director of the Institute of International Studies at the University of California at Berkeley. Take it away, Susan.
Great, thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's my great pleasure to moderate this panel on election security with a very ambitious goal of covering in a mere 90 minutes what the US can learn about elections from the rest of the world. First, thank you to SIGA and to Berkeley's new Center for Security and Politics for setting this up, and to Professor Napolitano for kicking things off today. Congratulations to you on the new center. We're all just absolutely thrilled with everything you're bringing to campus. So thanks again for bringing us together today. Before I introduce the panelists, I wanted to say a few words about the topic of election security, as I think it's one that invites a diversity of interpretations. Today, at least on this panel, we'll be talking about election security using a relatively expansive definition. Election security, broadly conceived, is something that includes procedures for running free and fair elections, protecting elections from efforts to undermine their democratic character, which would include but not be limited to overt forms of election fraud, politically motivated election violence, which can occur before, during, or after elections, foreign interference in elections, which would include international efforts to undermine voter support for democracy, as well as efforts to falsely undermine voter confidence in the electoral process. I'm here in part because I've been studying most of these issues for a long time, in part by looking at efforts by international actors to support democracy and elections around the world. As part of that research, I've served as an international election observer on formal delegations for elections in Afghanistan, Albania, Indonesia, Liberia, Nicaragua, Pakistan, and Venezuela, with several organizations, including the Carter Center, Democracy International, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. I've also done some related work in Bangladesh and in Cambodia, and part of my research focuses on global trends in elections across democracies and autocracies. In all this work, election security is a topic that I've spent quite a bit of time on and that I'm passionate about. One of the things that's very striking about my very recent experiences covering this topic is that although I've for the most part focused on efforts by outside actors to influence elections around the world, for the first time in my career, I spent in 2020, the US presidential election cycle, talking to journalists about how my research on election violence, election fraud, democratic backsliding, and the potential resilience of democratic institutions might be more applicable to US politics. So while in some ways this was disappointing as an American citizen, it's also something that for those of us who do focus on elections around the world and international standards for democratic elections has probably been a long time coming. It is the case, I'm aware it's the case, that some Americans, perhaps even some in the audience or many in the audience, have bought in deeply to this idea that American elections and American democracy are exceptional and perhaps beyond reproach. one thing I wanted to begin by emphasizing is that it has been clear since well before I started working in this area roughly 20 years ago that US elections and election administration have long fallen short of what are now international standards for democratic elections. The US is, for example, the only country in the world that explicitly allows for partisan administration of elections. It is strange for other people in other countries to hear that we allow elected secretaries of state to both run elections and be candidates in those same elections. That's something that's relatively unique to the United States. Voter identification has become a very partisan issue in the US, whereas in most countries around the world, it's pretty normal for the burden to be on an independent election commission to make voter identification and voter registration accessible to all eligible voters. Of course, this issue has become heavily polarized and partisan in the United States. As many in the audience will remember, there were calls for reform after the 2000 US elections, including, for example, by the National Commission on Federal Election Reform, led by former presidents Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. Much of this was reflected in the Help America Vote Act, passed shortly after they released their conclusions. And this did, I think, lead to some limited areas of progress. It was followed by another commission, the Carter-Baker Commission, which made further recommendations. But it is clear to me from reading about and having heard speak individuals like Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford, in part because of their prior experiences in both US politics and in promoting international standards for democratic elections, that there's a long list of changes that they've advocated for and that have been reasonably clear would help with US election security. When I talk about these issues, many people are surprised to learn that the US has invited international election observers since 2002, invited and had international election observers since 2002, most prominently from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. For the 2020 US elections, their preliminary post-election statement congratulated election administration in the US elections and congratulated their successes in running an election during such a severe part of the global pandemic, but also highlighted problems. And I wanted to mention those problems that they highlight because it does set up some of the conversation that we're having today, including political polarization that eclipsed substantive debate, unequal access to voter registration, US campaign finance laws that are easy to circumvent, as well as the stunning amount of money in US politics, and partisan efforts aimed at voter suppression, including what they document as 10 million voters who received automated disinformation phone calls aimed, I think, at suppressing their vote or dissuading them from turning out. Their biggest criticism, however, in this preliminary report, at least in my reading of this report, was the effort by the incumbent president to falsely undermine the integrity of an election. These are all very hot topics. One of the challenges in approaching this topic is that the consequences of problematic elections can endure beyond that election. Even if problems with election security were not severe enough to change who won an election, for example, if the election outcome is not that close, a voter who is turned away from the polls in one election may never try to vote again. On the other hand, they could also be mobilized into activism. Direct experience with fraud has been shown in other contexts, for example, in Mexican elections, to make some voters less likely to turn out for several subsequent election cycles. And we know, as I mentioned, in other cases, experience with problematic elections can also mobilize voters and make people more likely to participate. So judging the sum effect of violations of election security over the long term can be very difficult. When we think about politically motivated efforts to undermine elections, which is something that does happen in lots of countries around the world, one of the things that is clear is that some actors attempt to undermine elections without getting caught. And one can try to undermine voter confidence falsely without necessarily changing the real quality of the election or the real conditions on the ground. They may seek to maintain plausible deniability about the legitimacy of their actions. And except under some very specific circumstances, they don't usually admit to what they're up to, even when in some cases they're recorded taking actions that look very suspicious. This can make the academic study of election security very challenging at times, right? This is an illicit behavior in many cases. And so sometimes, or another thing that I wanted to bring into this conversation is that a lot of the terminology surrounding election security also becomes politicized, which is yet another challenge for those of us who are working in this space. For example, the term election integrity, which until this year was relatively benign, most people up until this point wanted elections with integrity, has recently become pretty politicized as something that's now being used to justify widespread efforts to pass new legislation that's aimed at suppressing voter turnout in the future, with the fairly obvious objective of suppressing votes that are not for one of the political parties. There are also a number of other violations of election security that may affect the outcome of the election, but may come about through administrative incompetence or other issues that are not necessarily partisan efforts to deliberately undermine democratic elections. And again, those things can also undermine voter confidence, as we'll talk about in this session. So as we talk about lessons from around the world that may be relevant to understanding the potential for democratic backsliding in the United States, as well as improvements to and violations of election security, it is important to keep in mind that there are a number of different relevant actors at play: the government in power, the bureaucracy, including election administrators, voters, political parties, all of which may have different preferences and different ways in which they may go about either working to protect the vote or working to subvert it, sometimes at the same time. It's now my pleasure to introduce our panelists, each of whom are exceptional in their fields, and bring with them not just wide-ranging substantive knowledge about elections in many countries around the world, but they've also been at the cutting edge of bringing rigorous research methods to policy-relevant questions that are connected to elections and the potential for electoral reform and election security. You'll note, and I'll just flag this, that some of their expertise is relevant to efforts to engaging in reforms that are aimed at improving efforts within relatively democratic contexts, right? So making democratic elections better in some form. The panel also includes individuals with expertise in areas that I would classify as efforts to undermine election security, but also potentially democracy. Right, so we're both talking about how to improve elections within a democratic context and ways in which some of these violations of election security might not just be problematic for the election, but might be problematic for democracy more generally, depending on the context. So I'll now go through and introduce our panelists very briefly. There's more extensive bios. I'm in no way summarizing all of their impressive qualifications. First, Catherine Casey is an associate professor of political economy at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. Her research explores the role of information in enhancing political accountability. She brings extensive experience working on these issues in the particular context of Sierra Leone and has worked elsewhere as well. Thomas Fujiwara is an associate professor of economics at Princeton University. His research seeks to understand why elected officials fail to provide adequate services and how the design of the electoral process can influence policymaking. He's worked on elections broadly in Benin, the Philippines, and Brazil. Gianmarco Leon Siliota is an associate professor at the University Pompeu Fabra. His research studies the determinants of voter participation and the way public policy interventions affect different dimensions of voter and politicians' behavior, like turnout, vote buying, accountability, and politician selection. His work focuses on Peru, Paraguay, and Austria, among other countries. And last but not least, my colleague, Ayla Matnock, is an associate professor of political science at the University of California, Berkeley. Her research addresses the ways in which political violence and elections intersect, and she has worked on these issues in, among other places, Colombia, Myanmar, and may touch also in her remarks on Sri Lanka. I've asked each of the panelists to open our conversation with a lesson or two from their own experiences that may be relevant to understanding US elections and the potential for reform. So as we open things up, I'd like to invite Professor Casey, to go first.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much for the intro. It's fantastic to be here. So I'm coming from the perspective of work we've done in Sierra Leone. So this, in terms of Susan's categories, this is in how can we make democracies work better? So to really deliver for citizens. And I want to focus on two kind of common problems. So, elections around the world face a number of challenges that are fairly universal. And the two I want to focus on are, how do we make sure that voters have the information they need to make good choices? And the second one is, how do we get great people to run as candidates for elected office? So I think these are universal challenges, and the solution is likely going to be very context specific. So things that work in Sierra Leone, very low income West African country, are probably not the solutions that are going to work here in the United States. But the message from Sierra Leone is about how you get from the problem to the solution that works in your context. And the message I want to share is one of bold experimentation, right? And so it's trying new, innovative policy reforms and then evaluating them very rigorously to see whether they're working better than what you're already doing. And so I just want to share two examples of bold experiments I've been involved in with civil society and the political parties in Sierra Leone. And there's one each on each of these two questions. So the first experiment I want to share is one about this question of, how do you get voters the information they need to make great choices? And so a little bit of context just to start. So Sierra Leone is a very low income country. So a lot of voters are illiterate. They haven't had access to public education. And there's also, in terms of media, there's just not a lot of great sources of reliable, unbiased political information. And you can think about some pretty rural farming communities who are going into an election who may have very little idea about how the office works, what the qualifications are, and who the candidates are that they're choosing between. So both this one and the next experiment I'm going to talk about are in the context of the Sierra Leone Parliament. And so the US analog you should have in your mind is the House of Representatives. So the US House, the elections are structured exactly the same way. So this question about how you get information to voters. So imagine you're in a rural village and people really have very little idea of what their options are. So the kind of bold solution that civil society partners wanted to test was, what if we could expose voters to these very engaging debates, right? So you could go and see a debate between parliamentary candidates and really get a sense for who they are, what they stand for, and what they're meant to be doing in office. So this is exactly what we did. So picture like a drive-in movie theater, except you're not going to drive there, you're going to walk there, right? So these are big public gatherings, and you're watching a video of the candidates running in your area, debating each other on merit, right? So how do we know whether this works? Well, where these drive-in cinemas or these walk-in cinemas are happening is kind of randomly allocated. So I can look at voters who got a chance to watch the debates versus those who didn't, and I can follow their behavior right through the elections. So what we found was these debates were incredibly successful at building voter knowledge, right? They gave voters a sense of what elected parliamentarians were meant to do, what the resources they had available to them, and what policies they stood for. And all of this information actually changed people's voting behavior. So voters start to shift to higher performing candidates. And I want to say a couple things about these debates. Susan raised some points about, sort of party politics eclipsing substantive debate and voter misinformation. So these debates are moderated by a very trusted member of civil society. They're 11 level playing field, so everybody running got equal airtime. They're focused on substance and on merit, right? So they are really talking about the nuts and bolts of government and policy and what these candidates are doing. So that was one experiment on the voter side that was very successful. And the second experiment I want to share is on this question of, how do you get great candidates? So for this one, the thing you need to know about Sierra Leone is, in the status quo, the parties, they select their own candidates. So think about a party, choosing all the candidates to run around the country. It's a very internal and from the outside pretty opaque process where, party leaders are, nominating and appointing candidates to run. The thing that is absent in the status quo is really any space for voters. And I just want to say, Sierra Leone here is much more representative than democracies around the world than the US system. And so what the political parties themselves are saying, and both major political parties participate in this experiment, was, how can we create more space for voters to have a direct voice in selecting who's going to run to be the candidate in this area? And what they did is pretty unusual, is that they took huge large representative surveys of all registered voters. So it's not just who shows up for a primary or who has the means to access of the polls. It's representative opinions of all voters. And they ask them, of these 4 potential candidates, who do you want the party to pick to be your candidate in this area? Right, and so they aggregated that information and incorporated it with their own information on these candidates to select different types of candidates. Now, how do I know the candidates are different? Because again, this is a randomized experiment. So these parties inside their own system are experimenting across different races with different ways of selecting candidates. So we can compare what the actual candidates look like once we get to the election. And what we found is actually when they created more space for voters, they were getting better candidates. And in particular, they're getting candidates who had been involved in providing a lot more local public goods in the past. And this is something that voters in this context really care about. So, to sum up, I think there's these universal challenges. What exactly the solution to these challenges looks like is going to vary a lot across countries, but the message is bold experimentation. What does that take? Well, it takes acknowledging that there's a problem, thinking about an innovative, bold solution, and then really be willing to test it rigorously and learn from this new experience. Thanks.
Thank you. Next, I'm going to turn to Professor Leon Siliota.
Hi, thank you very much for the invitation and for the gentle introduction. So as you mentioned, a large part of my research concentrates in studying the causes and consequences of electoral participation, right? And so by revealed preference, I think that electoral participation is a key element in the functioning of democracy, and a key element also for boosting electoral integrity and trust in democratic outcomes. Most of my work has focused in several countries in Latin America, with a particular focus in Peru. And while, as Kate mentioned, there are wide differences between the Latin American context and the US context, there are still some universal lessons to be learned from comparative research. So just to put things into perspective, we have to notice that the electoral participation in the US is low, right? In the 1980s and 90s, it was hovering around 50%. Since 2004, we've seen a relative increase, and by the last presidential elections, turnout reached a record high of 62%, right? This is still quite low in comparative terms. In most of Latin American or Western European countries, you see turnout rates that are somewhere around 75, 80%. Similarly for some countries in Southern Africa. So, so a bunch of my research has been on trying to understand who do we bring out to the polls when we enact national and blanket policies to try to incentivize electoral participation, and what are the consequences for representation, right? So there are two big messages that we get from this research. One is that you typically end up with these blanket policies, you typically end up drawing to the polls voters who are usually uninterested in politics and who are centrists. So therefore, getting them into the polls do not have effects on what the policies that get enacted are, but rather have implications for how they feel about the election. And this is important for when we're talking about election integrity, right? So what are the implications of these types of policies for election integrity? First, there is habit formation in voting, right? So consistently having voters who are left out of the electoral process can generate pockets of disaffected voters who first are completely left out of the political process and hence whose policies preferences are not represented in policymaking, right? Therefore, they're not going to identify with elected offices. When they decide to participate, hence, they may be more likely to be attracted by populist claims rather than candidate valence or programmatic politics, which is the discussion that we really want to be having in any democratic process. In contrast, people who consistently participate are more likely to be part of the political discussion, acquire information, be much more engaged in serious conversation about programmatic politics. So in general, the findings from the literature leads us to think that participation in elections provides legitimacy to the process. The more people participate in elections, the more people I see around me participating in elections, the more we perceive them as being fair, right? So just as an example, last night I downloaded data on electoral participation around U.S. states and how much the absentee voting was happening in the last elections, and you see that the facts just jump at your eyes, right? So places with higher turnout have massively higher rates of usage of these absentee ballots. Obviously, this is a correlation, but I think it goes in line with what we are finding in the literature, right? So, what policies can help increase political participation? In the U.S., there is a lot of experience with get out the vote campaigns, either led by political parties or their campaigns, and they do help in increasing turnout. However, the objective of these different types of campaigns is to generate a gap in the participation between voters from different parties. So no, that doesn't contribute in increasing the legitimacy in elections, right? Similarly, enfranchisement is helpful for widening representation, but again, here we are focusing on a specific set of voters, right? In the US, clearly mandating to vote, like we've done in many Latin American countries and some European countries, is a no-go. But there are some hard and soft policies that can be relatively easy to implement. And here I would agree with Kate that we need to start experimenting in what works and what doesn't, and the decentralized organization of elections in the US helps, right? So some ideas, just to trigger the discussion: automatic registration, which has been implemented in several US states, voting on a Sunday, stuff that is really, really easy to implement, right? Alternatively, what we see in some countries is that even without the mandate to vote, turnout is around 85%, right? And this is mostly because people perceive voting as a citizen duty. So non-partisan campaign in this direction can also be really helpful. So I'll just leave it there and we'll keep discussing later. Thank you.
Great. So now let's turn to Professor Fujiwara.
Thanks to everyone at SIGA, the Goldman School, and Berkeley for the opportunity to talk here. So I'd like to start by sharing some lessons from Brazil, so the world's fifth largest democracy, and in particular how Brazil has quite successfully administered its elections using electronic voting devices for over 20 years. And it has done so without any credible evidence of fraud and broad trust and support from the electorate. So the Brazilian electronic voting system is popular with Brazilian voters since it's easier to use than the previously used paper ballots. And it also allows election results to arrive quickly, right? So usually polls on election day close at 5 p.m. And in the same evening, the same night, the full results from almost 120 million votes cast are made public, which is an important part of electoral integrity, because it's in this period between polls closing and actual election results not being clear to to everyone that a lot of threats to electoral integrity or even democracy can occur. Okay. So the transition from paper ballots to electronic voting in Brazil happened in the 90s, and it was successful in large part because Brazil actually already differed from the US in some dimensions. So Brazil had a centralized national electoral authority. They had a lot of power to oversee and even coordinate or even actually tell what to do to the state level electoral authorities, right? And the whole electoral authority system at the state and national level, it is part of the judiciary branch, which is, by definition, independent from the executive and the legislatures. And that has been historically trusted and perceived as independent by the population, right? More so than most state institutions, right? And so on top of that, the Brazilian Electoral Authority also made a clear effort to have transparency regarding the voting process. Election data is made publicly available in Brazil in a way that's actually much easier for the average person to access data on elections than it is in the United States. And procedural documents are made public, all in a kind of centralized place. So the average Brazilian can actually go to the Electoral Authority website and collect all sorts of information that it's actually more difficult, even as a researcher, to find in the US, right? Another interesting lesson is that while the electronic voting devices in Brazil, they are what we call direct record, which means the vote tallying process happens without anyone actually handling pieces of paper. The electronic voting devices, they do produce ballot level printout of results. So for each ballot, which, the votes of say 200 to 500 people, it will print out what are the results of people that voted right at when the polling station closes. So that creates a paper trail that can be used to audit the results and could address, potential issues regarding, say, a cyber attack on a central vote tallying system. There are also some downsides to the Brazilian system, which are really not inherent to the system, but it is the way Brazil has implemented this, has these downsides. The first is that it does not allow absentee or mail voting. A voter can only cast her vote in the polling station she is registered to vote, right? Currently, the country is rolling out biometric vote information via fingerprints, which also has some, or can have some negative effects on voter registration and turnout, since it requires, every single voter to re-register to vote and provide their fingerprint to the authorities, right? These issues, however, they're counterbalanced by a system of mandatory voting, much like Gianmarco talked about before me, and by having elections on Sundays, which are kind of clearly a day set out for everybody to go vote, right? And lastly, just to kind of put things in context and compare to the United States, I should give it some context that since Brazil re-democratization in the 80s, right, the major parties and the leading presidential candidates, they have been committed to respecting electoral results. So I think Brazil sort of leveraged a system where the main political actors were committed to respecting electoral results. There was a central independent electoral authority, right? And now these things are changing. Right? The current president, Jair Bolsonaro, has been making claims of electoral fraud without producing any evidence whatsoever to back it up. The claims had little consequence in last year's municipal election, but Brazil is actually about to face probably its biggest threat in when it comes to electoral integrity, when it comes the federal elections next year. So I think there's interest parallels to observe how it will be handled there and how the US can learn to handle things here. Thank you.
Great, thank you. There's so many interesting things we'll touch on, but basically from this point forward, I'll be posing questions to the panelists. It'll be a little bit more conversational. We have some prepared questions, and then we'll turn to some questions that we've received from audience members and from people who have submitted questions prior to the panel. Oh, sorry, this is the greatest fear is that I would forget someone, and I just about started to do it. Ayla, please go ahead, Professor Mantenack, sorry.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, and thanks so much for organizing on this topic. So while there are many different challenges to electoral security, I'm going to talk about violence around elections, specifically starting with ties between politicians and armed groups. At times, politicians and armed groups have become really closely linked. My cross-country case-based research with Paul Stanleyland has shown that ties between politicians and armed groups are not unusual. Most armed groups actually do engage in some type of electoral participation, whether supporting particular candidates or coercing others. And many politicians are also open to this type of influence. So my cross-national data tracking the most overt types of these links shows that these ties between politicians and armed groups often become endemic in really different contexts. So different levels of democracy, different levels of development. Rather than focusing in on one case for this particular type of research, we've really looked across a set of cases, and I've collected data across a set of cases. I think these links form between politicians and armed groups because, simply put, they can benefit both of them. So armed groups can use ties to tilt outcomes towards positions that match their own political aims and agendas, as well as to recruit, organize, and attack more openly with sympathetic politicians in office. Politicians, though, also can use this tool in much the same way that they use other types of violence, one-sided repression, communal violence. The illegal activity can mobilize some of their most enthusiastic supporters, but it can also deter legal activities. So intimidating politicians to do less campaigning and legislating, dissuade citizens from voting or supporting their preferred candidates, and blocking civil servants from trying to do their jobs. So these ties between armed groups and politicians have the potential to undermine democracy, and we've been talking about them increasingly in the media recently. I think, in terms of suggestions going forward, once politicians become tied to armed groups, separation is not always so simple. Our work suggests that there are a few things to do beyond law enforcement that rely really on civil society and citizens. So first, monitoring and identifying these ties throughout the electoral cycle is really crucial. Government officials, but also journalists, analysts, academics can help do this. The important thing here is that many of the links between politicians and armed actors are covert. And even when the ties are out in the open, the specific language often allows politicians to deny them if pressured. This occurs across the cases that we look at. Calling them out and identifying patterns can help mobilize action. So once identified, how do we hold politicians or armed actors accountable? Law enforcement, of course, has a crucial role in this. The police and the judicial system's consistent response keeps armed groups reined in. Based on our work in the US and other contexts, however, we're a little bit concerned that politicians can at times push for uneven policing, and sometimes law enforcement bias and even open sympathies can actually be part of this violence. Beyond law enforcement, most of the ties to politicians also require a different approach because they're often not verifiably illegal, even if patterns and other evidence exists. So holding politicians accountable for their ties to armed groups can involve things like political processes such as sanctions or impeachment, funding cuts by campaign donors, social media or other media companies enforcing policies about language, and ultimately disapproval expressed by voters, by constituents. So recently, Martha Crenshaw, drawing on her decades of research on homegrown terrorism, wrote that this break really happens when, quote, the community that they claim to represent rejects them, that is, rejects violence, and that seems to be really crucial here too. So I would say that in terms of the spectrum, this is more on the how do we avoid some of the really negative outcomes that we see in other places, but we have seen sort of broad-based efforts to reject violence in different contexts. So even though our work shows that many elections feature violence and that because there are these benefits involved, these cycles can be really hard to break, I am hopeful that we may find some solutions going forward. So I'll leave it there and look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Wonderful. There's so many interesting things here. Isla, I think the questions that you're raising are really fundamental right now and do connect to these ways in which the US is experiencing things that it hasn't experienced for a little while. And so therefore we have this need to draw on examples from other contexts, highlighting the conversation we're having today. The next question I'd like to follow up with is just to ask our panelists to perhaps join some of our audience members in thinking about why it's a little bit difficult to compare the US to other countries and to think about both similarities and perhaps differences between the cases that you're familiar with. So in what ways should we think about surprising similarities between the US and other places? And in which ways should we think about differences that are maybe really important to emphasize, ways in which the US just isn't like other countries and doesn't have good comparisons that we should be making to other cases? Let's see, I'll ask Professor Casey to go first.
Great. Well, since I'm, talking about Sierra Leone, which is, a very low income West African country, I think you can think of a lot of differences that, some are surprising, some are not. But what I want to talk about is the similarities. So Sierra Leone has a fairly stable two-party system like the US. So the two parties that are the major parties now are the same parties that were formed around independence in the 1960s. And one thing I think is interesting is because there are affiliations, sort of regional sorting. So there's affiliations, there's kind of two major ethnic groups and two major political parties, and one is in the north and one's in the south. So it's pretty stable, they each have sort of equal size support. But what this means, this geographic sorting, is that when you come down, so presidential elections are super competitive, right? Because each party has kind of equal shares. When you go to the subnational level, like thinking about, the US House of Representatives, you get these very kind of homogenous local districts, right? And what does that mean? That means like local elections are a landslide for one party or the other. So for example, I'm at Stanford, it's in Palo Alto. So if you think about our House district, you go to the general election, whoever the Democratic candidate is, almost doesn't even matter who that person is, they're going to the 75% of the vote versus 25% of the vote for the Republican candidate, right? That's a 50 percentage point spread. And that just happens again and again and again, right? The same thing in Sierra Leone. So that's pretty much, Palo Alto would be pretty much the median distribution in terms of how uncompetitive a local election is. And so, there's also, there's two political scientists, Jim Snyder and Shigeo Horano, wrote this beautiful book on US primaries. But this is one of the things they were pointing to, is that it's not just Palo Alto. Like, if you look at all US House elections over the last 70 years, a majority of them were decided by more than a 15 percentage point spread, right? That is a landslide, right? So most of the US House elections anyway are also very, very lopsided. So this kind of ties back to like why I wanted to talk about that second experiment on how you select candidates, because in a place like Palo Alto, the general election doesn't really matter, right? You know the Democratic candidate's going to win. So the question is, who is the Democratic candidate and how is that person selected, right? And who had a say, who turned out, who participated. And I think that's where, that's why it's really important to think about who's putting themselves forward and who's participating in that process of winnowing that group of potential candidates down. And I just want to say, so one surprising difference, and this comes back to Gianmarco's point, and as a shout out to voters in Sierra Leone, turnout is not mandatory in Sierra Leone. The last two general elections, it was 84 and 87% turnout. So that's, not mandatory, and it's just a phenomenal level of voter participation.
That is truly impressive. Let's see, Professor Leon Siliota, do you want to get in on this?
Yeah, sure. So one thing that really got me thinking about the similarities between Latin America and the US is the use of political trials, right? So after the last couple of impeachments of former President Trump, political trials are useful instruments for democracy to punish misconduct by elected officials outside election periods, right? We typically have very little tools are at our hands outside election periods to punish politicians, right? And however, these institutional safeguards at times can be a double-edged sword, right? And this brings me back to a project I was working recently in Peru, where there are recall elections for mayors around the country, and they happen very often. The problem here is that there is a fine line when you are trying to punish an elected official for having misconduct and when you're using these institutional tools for political purpose. What I found in that project in Peru is that when potential candidates perceive that a political trial is used with political motives, that ends up deterring potentially very good candidates. Basically, people who are thinking about entering politics see that they may be kicked out because of political motivations, and they say, well, I may as well stay in my well-paid private sector position, right? So what's a parallel here? When you have such often happening impeachments like what we've seen lately, and when you have voting, in this case in the House and in the Senate, completely split against party lines, this completely undermines the objectives of these political trials. In the sense that one of the benefits of having these discussions in public is airing some potential facts that may document wrongdoing by elected officials. Once the voting in the House and in the Senate is completely split along party lines, this undermines the credibility of these facts and completely erases the potential usefulness of these political trials, right? And this can have potential downward effects on the selection of people who decides to enter the political race at different stages.
I think the quality of candidates is a really interesting theme that's coming out of some of these reforms. Professor Matnock, will you jump in on this question too?
Sure, yeah, I was also thinking about sort of the response to these different types of threats, and especially thinking about electoral violence. And so picking up on some of Gianmarco's comments just now, thinking about there's a wide range of what we think the government will do in response to this. At times, the political violence is so deeply ingrained and linked to the judicial sector, the policing sector, that there's really no hope in some countries that there will be sort of any type of response from those bodies. And in other cases, there's much more hope. And I think the US has shifted between those different opinions over the course of recent events. And so, you know, there are cases that look a lot more like the US, like there's an incident with parapolitics in Colombia where there were links between paramilitaries and politicians in the legislature, and there were investigations, there were court cases brought about the collusion between these politicians and the paramilitaries. But there were also important roles played by politicians who tried to pass more legislation to sort of sanction this. It was sometimes blocked, but also through activists. So there were widespread protests. Lots of different organizations wrote about this. And then also there were journalists and others who actually uncovered some of these links. Samana magazine was one of those that was sort of responsible for doing a lot of this work. So I think in these cases, we can sort of see this like universe of responses. It's not clear that all of those might exactly apply to the US, but it certainly fits somewhere between the spectrum of like places where the government is completely involved in this type of violence and places where it's like not at all involved. And so thinking about sort of the most effective response to it is likely going to fit somewhere in the middle and encompasses some of these reactions and responses that we've seen in other cases.
Great, thank you. And then Professor Fujiwara, will you jump in a little bit here?
Yes. So I think what I'll say, echo a little bit what Gianmarco also said is, I think what like voters, I think in any country expect a little bit is that at some point there's some independent authority who make a call on what results are. So right, so there's like in the United States there's this independent or the institution that plays this role would be the judiciary, would be courts, right? And if it gets there, it will be eventually the Supreme Court. I was remember from the 2000 election, right? And I think that's a good example because it was clear, in 2000, there was a ruling, and then one candidate said, okay, that's the ruling, right? Al Gore said, that's it, right? I'll concede, right? So, and I think here were like two things that are perhaps a little different in the United States from other countries is that the judiciary is not perceived by, I think, big part of the population with good reason as independent, right? Because federal judges are appointed by the federal government, and because state judges are appointed by state governments, because people look at the Supreme Court and they can clearly attach each judge to a particular party, right? You create the system where it's sort of the population expects and then a kind of independent referee to come and call things one way or the other, which is kind of difficult. And so going back a bit to the example in Brazil, I think that's a country that can't handle this well because the electoral authority is part of the judiciary and they're not appointed by particular parties. They can sort of play this role of being perceived, at least by the population, as a non-political actor. And not only that, I think they navigate this in ways that are complicated, like going back to the political trials that Gianmarco said, like say they are responsible to make claims about does the sitting president broke electoral rule by taking off the book campaign donations, right? And I think a lot of times they shy away from making rulings there because they know the moment they step in, they'll be perceived as political. So it's a very difficult trade-off people have to navigate, right? And I think the United States has this particularity that kind of permeates it, is the idea once the judiciary is perceived as also as political and partisan, it's hard for the population to see, their decisions as kind of being independent, right? But kind of as a kind of fair referee calling which way the election went.
I think I'm going to circle back in a second to a question that's very much related to what you were just talking about. But for now, I do want to think about a question that's been on my mind as we've prepared for this panel, which is that when we talk about the potential for reform in the US, if you're just reading public commentary and whatnot, there's a lot of pessimism, right? There's a lot of a sense that it's hard to get multiple political parties on board. Kate, one of the things I was struck by in your comments was just that all of the parties are willing to participate in these efforts to make the process more inclusive for voters. And that was true across apparently the entire political spectrum, right? That just seems to be not the case right now in the United States. And so I wanted to give our panelists a chance to say a word or two about whether there is anything from their experiences that suggest ways in which countries can move from intense polarization, perhaps even in post-Civil War contexts, to moments in which there's a willingness to adopt reforms and to move towards improvements in electoral processes. Professor Matnock, could you please go first?
Sure, thank you. So I'm afraid I'm going to be relatively pessimistic on this front in terms of electoral violence. I think there's really this possibility of getting very stuck in these cycles. And so, I've mentioned some of the ways in which we might get out. And I think, a country that is in this cycle might get out of it. But I think there is this big question about who politicians or who can hold politicians accountable in these contexts where they're really acting outside of the system, whether it's through something like electoral fraud or electoral violence, which happens to be what I study. There are super interesting other, political science works on this that suggests that the, people who are closest to those who are using these tactics themselves, so political allies or advisors, might be most in the position to call out or sanction this, both because others will be most persuaded by their messaging because it's surprising, right? It's coming from the people who are closest, and also because it sort of signals that they have the same interests, but they're willing to use a different mechanism. That said, I think that there are cases in which political violence is used, especially by politicians, because it's benefiting them, right? And so it's in some way that we need to break the cycle of benefits from these mechanisms, whether it's fraud or violence or something else in these contexts. And I think that can be hard to do. I do study post-conflict elections, and I think there are ways in which that you can sort of shock the cycle in a way that resets the equilibrium, and then you have sort of a new playing field that eventually improves gradually. But I think these gradual institutional changes is something that we actually have less of an idea about how they occur in some of these contexts in a way that's really positive. So I would say I'm on the pessimistic end of the spectrum, but I'm hoping my colleagues have other suggestions that are more optimistic.
Well, we can always hope. Thank you, Professor Leon.
Siliota.
Sorry,
No worries.
I was trying to think about my next question. Siliota.
So let me put the more optimistic side here. So once and again, when we've seen big packages of electoral reform trying to get passed in Latin America, they have been blocked by national forces, right? So in general, getting past big reforms to electoral systems is hard. One advantage that the U.S. has with a very, very decentralized organization of elections is that it allows for what Kate was saying earlier, right? It allows for bold experimentation. And we know that once one thing works, it is much easier to push it higher ups in the political discussion, right? So that's one thing that I would highlight, that we should push local administrators to try to dig deep and come up with some creative solutions that can be scaled up to national policies.
Great. Let's see, Thomas. Go ahead.
Yes, I just want to follow up. I think, yes, there's the I think on a more optimistic take, there's this, because the United States has this decentralized administration, there's much more room for the bold experimentation. And one aspect I think in the pessimist view that I think is people are overestimating is that how certain it is that each reform will kind of have the effect that the people pushing for the reform are taking. So there's a lot of unintended consequences in these reforms, right? So to give a current example, let's say in some state, the Republican Party is pushing to curb, say, mail voting because they think that will help them in elections. But that's actually a very uncertain thing. They're probably basing on something that happened in this last election during a pandemic, right? It's not obvious it will happen So like, I wouldn't say take a bet that every time that you curb mail voting, that increases the Republican vote share, right? But in that sense, I think is as states will do these things, some reforms, even if they're kind of say being done with the intent of kind of tilting things to one party, it may kind of backfire by not happening. So then there'll be kind of this back and forth, right? So there'll be there'll be room for improvement, right? Especially like to returning things up for the way they they were. Maybe some changes will kind of stuck around because voters like it. It's actually I think there's a part of an optimistic. It's not as easy to kind of tinker with electoral administration to get the things to go to kind of tilt the scales in the direction of one party versus the other, right? I guess in the research from all the panelists here, you can see there's a lot of kind of unintended consequences, things that kind of happen the way you don't quite expect it ex ante to happen.
There's something very interesting there, which is one of my favorite article titles that has nothing to do with this. It's called Driving with the Rearview Mirror. And a lot of times, because there's so many ways to undermine elections and so many ways to try to counter those methods of undermining elections, reforms are aimed at the problems of the last cycle, not attempting to try to guard against what are the most likely problems in the future cycle. And if you're really intent, much like a burglar or something like that, if you're really intent on getting into the house, you might not go for the method of getting into the house that the person just set up security for, right? You might come up with a new method. And so there are some very interesting aspects to this. Kate, did you want to follow up on this too?
Yeah, I will. So, I think the kinds of things that the parties and civil society have been doing in Sierra Leone are kind of inherently an optimistic example, but I wanted to, like, some pragmatic aspects of this kind of idea of experimentation is what you don't have to roll out a national reform that changes everything, right? I think Gianmarco talked about this. So you can start small, start with a pilot. This is really inherent to learning, right? You need to try some things and compare it to others. So you can also, when you're thinking about a pilot, you need to think about what are the strategic considerations of the people that need to participate, right? So let me just give you, coming back to my two experiments, sort of pragmatic ways to think about it. So when you think about the debates between candidates that are, then broadcast to all these voters, once you have one candidate signed up and a neutral party committed to broadcasting that candidate's perspective, the other candidate, the cost of opting out now becomes really huge, right? So now if I don't participate, my rival is going to get all of this free campaign advertising, right? So maybe particularly like an incumbent didn't want to show up right away, but then geez, if the challenger is going to be broadcast to thousands of voters at basically no cost to that candidate, I'm not going to miss this out. And then you have this coordination where you can kind of corral everybody in, right? So that's kind of strategic considerations facing candidates on the campaign trail. And this idea of piloting, so that experiment where the parties themselves are experimenting in how to select candidates, that did not roll out across all races at one go, right? So a very first important step. So first of all, we worked with Political Parties Registration Commission, which again, this is part of the government that is the regulator of parties. So again, it's a nonpartisan platform. But the first thing they said is, we only have limited budget. So which races would you be even willing to experiment with this new selection mechanism in, right? So then the party leaders themselves can hive off races that, are too contentious, too politically sensitive, where they are not ready to try something new. And they can pick a set of races where they are willing to experiment. And then, the research team could come in and randomize which of those can be the new ones, which are going to be the status quo, right? So it's kind of this idea of, what are people's strategic incentives to try something new? And when you're starting things from a pilot and scaling them up, you can make these strategic accommodations and compromises that is then sort of incentive compatible for everybody to participate in it.
I really like that point. I think that's a very social scientist sort of contribution, but I think it's important to think about in this context and in this conversation. I wanted to follow up on these issues associated with sort of trust and neutrality and polarization. These are issues that have come up in other countries. I remember when I was election observer in Venezuela in 2004, we were basically being timed outside of polling stations. And if we talked to one voter for 30 seconds longer than, who was wearing a partisan color than another voter, At one point we almost got arrested for some slight difference in the time we were spent talking to different voters. And these things get to a point where nobody trusts anybody. So sometimes international observers are put forward as a sort of neutral judge of the quality of elections. We've also brought up independent election commissions as a potentially important actor. Several of you have mentioned this trusted organization from civil society or something like that. And I wondered if you could just say a bit more about who these actors are in the context in which you've worked, who is trusted, who is legitimate. And when there are issues with voter confidence in the electoral process, can that be addressed in any way that would be useful for folks to hear about in relation to the US elections? Let's see, Isla, go ahead.
Great. So I'll start with just a couple of comments about this. I think, I've mentioned that there is sort of these interesting political science studies about how people can be most persuaded by messengers with whom they share common values, right? So there is a reason why parties send their own observers to monitor elections, and it's not just because if things go wrong, they want to have been there, but also because if things go right, they want to sort of be the people saying, yes, like this was a legitimate election, right? And so I think there is sort of this, like, especially on violence, there is this question about getting the people who are closest to the particular audience that you're targeting to reject violence, to reject electoral violence, right? Those seem to be the most trusted sources based on sort of like de-radicalization literature and preventing the use of violence. In electoral context in general, I wanted to actually bring up the point that you just mentioned, Susan, but specifically with relation to electoral violence, which is that there have been some really interesting studies, which you know well, but perhaps others don't, about electoral violence actually being displaced by having international monitors. So that in some contexts, international monitors can actually provide a check on these elections. And so you actually are getting a displacement of violence as a strategy. And I think it's important to think about like what violence is doing, what a lot of these other disruption strategies are doing, right? Fundamentally, they're about political exclusion, whether it's like in the initial phases where you're trying to get people not to participate in the electoral cycle, or whether it's in the later phases where you're trying to get a change in the outcome in terms of who actually comes into power. And so having this, observation, this third-party observation can be really useful. Now, that said, in some contexts, including in the US, only certain parties really trust particular outside actors as being neutral. We've seen some cool survey work on this in recent years, both in the US and Tunisia, by people like Sarah Bush and Lauren Prather. And so I think there's really great evidence that this can at times work and it can displace violence. But who the trustworthy sources are for this outside intervention or this outside observation specifically, I think might vary by context and is something we would need to assess in each election.
Thomas, go ahead.
Yes. So on this issue of like building trust and our view of neutrality, I think we could talk a lot about like specific steps an electoral authority can do to make it transparent, to make it clear, to make it like the ballots and the envelopes all look trustworthy. But I think there's like a natural limitation where at some point outside forces can outside the entities have to tell people these are valid results. And I think then you really rely, say on the media being perceived as independent and telling these were the results that happened. This is like or this was a free and fair election. And I think there's another entity we don't talk about it, but it's the politicians themselves. I think a lot of like what make a functioning democracy works is a system where the parties on their own will concede and always kind of say, when they lose, they say, "This is what I lost. Like my challenger, my opponent won in a free and fair place." So in a way, it's kind of easier said than done, right? I can say here, well, we should have an independent media that kind of makes this work for us. We should have politicians and parties that are well behaved. But I think as actors, everybody's a political actor to some extent. I think it's important to always push on that. Let's say of the disagreements when you see different candidates, different parties taking some different positions, you can agree, disagree. But I think everyone, as voters, as donors, as civil society members, we should understand, like, when somebody makes statements that kind of crosses the line into, undermining election, they're really crossing a line that is very different from others, right? It's something they kind of can undermine the democracy, right? So let's say, I think a lot of what makes these things work in other countries is that parties are kind of able to push out the candidates or its members that actually would be willing to make these claims. Like, say, when one candidate loses, he can say, "Oh, I didn't win fair and fairly," but maybe his other members of his party said, "No, like, you have to concede because next election will be someone else, and we want this system to keep running the way it is." So I think there's a lot of that, like, is just policing and punishing the people to try to deviate from making unfounded claims that the elections that are free and fair are not free and fair. Yeah.
Thomas, yesterday in our planning meeting, you mentioned one way in which the Brazilian government has increased trust in the electronic voting systems in Brazil. And you mentioned a hacker competition. Will you tell us a little bit more about that again?
Oh, yes. So the Brazilian electoral, they also try to make all these steps to make the electronic devices perceived as trustworthy. So one kind of clever thing they did is they hold an yearly kind of hacker competition. So they say, like, we'll give an award to the person who comes up with the most effective way to hack into the machines, right? And I think that creates kind of trust in the thing. Because they can show we're actively asking people to do their best job to undermine security so they can defend it. And also because the winners of these hacking competitions, they are so convoluted and so kind of they come up with things that are so complex to do that it almost, I say, well, it would be impossible to do, right? So usually it involves somebody say, "Oh, I'm going to hook up a cable to the device," which obviously, the election workers would see, or say, "Oh, I'm going to kind of set up a big radio that has to be within, half a yard from the polling device, and then I'll interfere with the." So it's. I think the kind of it also shows, like, how hard it would be to kind of actually engage in this, right? The system is very, right. It's not designed in a safe way, right? It doesn't, right? It's not like every device is linked to the internet and somebody can hack it. It's actually much more complex, and it involves,
very complex ways of going about it. I think that these ways of establishing confidence are really, really important. And one of the things that several of you have highlighted in your comments is just all of the ways in which creating doubt and sowing doubts about these more reliable actors can be very destructive to democratic elections and to election security. So I think that's another theme that's coming out of this. Gianmarco?
Yeah, I just want to make a quick comment going back to the original point that I made about turnout being one important determinant of trust in elections, right, and generating voting confidence. So I was mentioning that there is some time persistence within individual, right? When you vote one time, you're likely to vote one time again. The second dimension of correlation is in the cross section, right? When you see more people around you doing something, you're also you think about it much more carefully, right? And we see these with vaccines right now, right? The numbers of people who were willing to receive a vaccine has gone in the complete opposite trend as the way vaccination has moved, right? And this is as some people say that this is mostly due to the fact that once you know something who has taken up this vaccine, I'm more likely to trust it. Similarly with elections, right? When you see that more people are going to vote, that implies that they trust the system. When more people vote, that transmits much more trust.
Let's see, Kate, you wanted to jump in on this too?
Yeah, I just wanted to just close out just by sharing a story about Sierra Leone. So Sierra Leone was involved in a very brutal civil war that ended in 2002. And given some of the background I gave you about, very intense two-party rivalry and competition. So there's those first elections after the war was over were like extremely high stakes election. So the story I want to tell is just one about the power of individual leadership and particularly the head of the newly formed National Electoral Commission, again, which is an independent, nonpartisan government agency that oversees elections in Sierra Leone. The first director of that was Dr. Christiana Thorpe. So she's just an amazing person in a lot of ways. She's worked in human rights, advocating for girls' education, but she's also a former nun, and just her substance and her reputation and her leadership style, I think, was just incredible for overseeing those first very contentious, very high stakes elections. And just a sense of like some of her accomplishments was there were different local elections that would be contested, some with the ruling party, some with the opposition party. And she was seen as a fair arbiter and, making calls and, for the right outcome, regardless of which party was contesting. Mm-hmm. And just as a sign of her accomplishment, like there's peaceful transitions of power, actually even beyond her, multiple transitions of power between the ruling party and the opposition, even at the presidential level since the end of the war, which is actually very exceptional, at least in the neighborhood of sub-Saharan Africa. So, it's a story. It's not an experiment, but it's. I think there's a lot of potential for people's trust in a particular leader and their reputation and the approach they bring to the office that they have that can really do a lot in terms of building trust and legitimacy in the system.
Mm-hmm. I think that's very much interesting, and it's curious for me to think about, just from what I know of U.S. elections, just who might be able to play that role in the context of the U.S. elections. We did get a question from the audience about whether, this is from Michael Campos, about whether international election monitoring should be used now more than ever when questioning election security, and whether it should focus less on their assessment with an eye towards an international audience for that assessment and more towards the domestic population. That does seem to be like a question that is two-sided. Sure, the international election observers can target their assessment towards domestic audiences, but that doesn't mean that they'll listen. And so this notion of sort of credible actors and thinking through, who U.S. audiences, who audiences around the world, when you're in a political context in which distrust has grown very high, how can you reestablish trusted sources of information? And I do think I want to throw out here, at the risk of throwing our panelists off guard a little bit, one of the other questions that we got from the audience, which is from Ben Greenberg from Vote Shield. And the question is that disinformation around election fraud, even when no evidence exists, is a relevant issue for the US and other countries. How can governments maintain public trust when their legitimacy is threatened by an unprecedented media ecosystem? And so if I can just expand slightly on the question and say that I know that the current media environment is something that is also affecting elections in a lot of other countries around the world. There's, micro-targeting of disinformation from abroad. There is efforts to sort of splinter and discredit the media. A lot of the things that are happening in the US are happening in other countries as well, including this issue raised by Ben Greenberg about disinformation around election fraud, which can of course come from domestic sources or international sources. And so there is a follow-up question on this question of trust, but specifically related to the media ecosystem. So I don't, if any of you want to chime in on this, or if I'm allowed to see if any of you want to jump in. I guess I almost want to ask our distinguished host, Janet Napolitano, if she has opinions on this, but I don't want to put her on the spot. There's a lot of ways in which the media environment, I think, is changing in a lot of countries in the world, in which scholars are still catching up with. So,
I think what's hard for us to kind of jump in and talk is because it's unprecedented. I think social science is still kind of grappling with like what is like how this is different and how to deal with that. And I think especially the how to kind of push back on this, so what is the best way to fight the spread of disinformation online, right? Should be spread fact checking back to people online? Can we kind of rely entirely on the traditional media to kind of say, no, these things that we know are circulating in your social media groups are false, right? But I think because it's new, we're still kind of grappling a lot with how to deal with this, right?
I'll chime in and say, one of the very earliest reports from an international observer group that I've located is from the 60s, an observation mission by the Organization for American States. I believe it was in the Dominican Republic. Includes basically a complaint about a disinformation effort, that there was a rampant rumor going around that these ballot envelopes that voters had to open to sort of access their ballot contained a flammable powder so that they would explode in their face. And this is in the 60s, right? This is, and it was apparently disinformation and a rumor as far as the report could tell. So in some ways, some of these trends might be just more prevalent in terms of the damage that disinformation can do. So this was, the thing I'm talking about in the Dominican Republic was just an isolated incident. But in some ways, maybe the new thing is how expansive it is and how many people it's influencing. Isla, maybe you can go.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that I do think there is a particularly important role for the media in a lot of these electoral processes, and thinking about election violence in particular. These ties between politicians and armed groups, as I mentioned, and others have written, in the U.S. context, for example, that these are often left. So Paul Stanley and I are in our work, we define these as being either overt or covert links, and often both politicians and armed groups want to keep them covert. And then also in terms of whether it's direct or indirect support. So indirect support might be something like targeting a particular politician's opponent, right? Versus actively supporting that politician by giving them funds or something. So if you have indirect participation and it's covert, the only way to find this is by producing more information, right? And so there are certainly government structures that sometimes investigate this, but we've also seen a lot of these cases around the world be identified through the media. So there is now this unprecedented media ecosystem, as the questioner says, but there is also this really important role for the media to play in many cases in sort of identifying some of these links, and actually bringing them to light. And so it's kind of a fine line. And as Thomas says, I think we're still sort of in the early days of figuring out exactly what the role is there and how to get sort of the best role in terms of strengthening democracy.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's so much that we could cover, and I think that there's another question I kind of want to circle back to that touches on a lot of things that you all have brought up already. But I'm again just trying to push along this comparison with the U.S. and thinking about problems that, as I said in my introductory remarks, feel like things that people are paying attention to again in the U.S. as problems that are new-ish, that maybe the U.S. had historically, but is experiencing again. And these are problems associated with foreign interference in elections in the past few election cycles, false accusations of election fraud, concerns that election violence would disrupt the pre-election period. There were concerns before the election that election violence would be used to disrupt election day, and violence in the post-election period. And so I'm wondering if our panelists can turn to this question. Gianmarco, why don't you go first?
Yeah, so foreign intervention in elections can have negative effects on two dimensions. One, on whether they are actually effective at affecting the election outcome through different ways, hacking or whatever. But second, on how it triggers public discourse, right? And here I think we have something to learn from the experience of Latin America in the past 60 or 70 years, right? So in the past few elections, whenever there is a leftist candidate fielded, there are always claims about financing coming from Venezuela. In the past, going back to the 60s, 70s, 80s, associations with Cuba, and the danger with that is that it drives the focus away from what we should actually be focusing on, right? So it triggers a debate based on basically what could be considered as rumors. So and here the hard question is again, how do we go back from these discussions about rumors to programmatic politics, right? And there some experiences from other countries. I mean, Thomas has done fantastic research in Benin on how like encouraging politicians to discuss programmatic issues actually generate much more trust among people, increases turnout, and so on. I mean, he can tell about his research much better than I. But we should not only focus on trying to get at the point of the intervention, right? So if we're talking about Russian hackers, how do we put together the correct safeguards, but also all the stuff that is coming up in the media later that divert us from discussing substantive issues.
I think that you know, I do want to connect the answer to this question to things that Isla has already talked about, and we have a few other questions from the audience that I just want to introduce very briefly. And I can address some of them, and we'll see if the panelists have things to say. The first is from Owen Siliota from the Zambia Statistics Agency, who asks whether there are machine learning applications that could be used in advance to prevent election fraud. And I'll start, I guess, by saying that, that's one other question too. I'll just put two out. This is from Grace Gordon from UC Berkeley. How do countries around the world handle the harassment of election officials? I'll say that I'm part of a group thinking about how to push for nonpartisan election administration in the US, and the reports back from election officials are that they are experiencing significant harassment in this cycle, right? That this is something that's a really major problem. And many, going back to some of the comments that the panelists made earlier about good candidates running for office, anecdotally, what we're hearing in the US is that a lot of pretty good election administrators are quitting, right? That they're saying they've had enough of their families being harassed and targeted with threats of violence and generally being accused of being partisan when in fact they're doing their job by most accounts. So I wanted to throw those two questions out there. On the first question about machine learning, I wanted to also mention that one of the more terrifying statistics I've heard about disinformation is that because it can be produced using AI and using various algorithms, that you can have like just the amount of disinformation on YouTube about elections around the world that's auto-produced is more than any of us could, than humans can even listen to, right? The volume far exceeds human capacity to monitor it. And so in that sense, it's not election fraud, it's not directly addressing the question, but I do think it's interesting to think about the problems associated with elections in which machine learning applications, as well as some other forms of more advanced technologies might be very helpful. And that's one area, the sort of combating disinformation where it just seems necessary because humans are not going to be able to deal with it. I do think that there's a lot of things that we could talk about here, but let's see, Kate, do you want to reference some of the election fraud detection?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think to our colleague from the statistics office, so this is not directly in response to the role of machine learning, but just is kind of a slightly lower tech example. Like there have been a lot of studies where kind of the more classical election fraud, like ballot stuffing and, wholesale theft has been detected after the fact, really by sort of statistical anomalies, like, there's too many people have voted, or the kind of patterns of numbers, like there's too many, if you actually had random numbers between 1 and 9, there'd be sort of uniform distribution. But when people make up numbers, like to report numbers, they tend to like overstate certain numbers. So you can kind of, there have been these studies that sort of these forensic statistical studies that sort of can detect fraud after it's happened. I know your question was more about preventing fraud, but I think one of the kind of promises of, just sort of data, big data and data analysis in general is it can be done very quickly, right? So if you can think of ways that it can be happening in real time, maybe it doesn't prevent someone from trying, but you could probably pick it up. And coming back to like Thomas's points about electronic voting, like there's a lot of analysis that can be done in real time. And if, you had a monitoring team that could come in, very quickly, it might have a preventative role as well as, in addition to sort of this complementary ex post kind of forensic analysis.
Isla?
Yeah, so I was going to say, related to this, not exactly addressing that question either, but thinking about in general how we get like data on what's going wrong in elections. I think electoral violence can be one of the things that's actually most difficult to get data on. And so we actually have a large scale study in Côte d'Ivoire where we're looking at different mechanisms for doing this. So we're looking at household surveys, surveys of leaders, and then also like monitors sent to different places. Plus, what's widely available right now is like media reports on where there's electoral violence. And so thinking about just even how do you actually measure and get a grasp of violence, let alone fraud or these other types of inherently hidden influence, is, I think, really one of the trickiest questions and one of sort of the places that I hope the field is going to spend more time thinking about, and definitely is something that now is newly relevant to the US. I think, as you mentioned, Susan, I think we're all being asked to think about the US elections for the first time, perhaps in our careers, because some of these issues really do pick up. But I think actually detecting not only fraud, but all of these other types of like influence in the elections can be really difficult. We see cool protest data now collected in a variety of ways. And I think we'll be seeing more of this on electoral violence specifically committed by the state as well going forward.
Thank you, Isla. Gianmarco, did you want to add to this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to say about machine learning applications, but I wanted to comment on Kate's point about the analysis of electoral data and how can that help us detect early election fraud by bringing up the example of the last Bolivian election, right? So data can be very useful, but it has to be used well. It can be extremely dangerous if it's not, right? And the example of the Bolivian election, I think, is very informative. What happened is that Evo Morales was running for re-election. I think that by the evening of the election, he was losing by quite a bit. Suddenly, there was an information shutdown for a few hours. When information started flowing again, Evo Morales ended up winning by a relatively large margin, right? So no one's stopped and did a very careful data analysis, as the one Kate was suggesting, but some electoral observers, and notably the Organization of American States, put out a statement saying this change in the results in so few hours is suspicious, and that was used as a data point to push Evo Morales Evo Morales' election as a fraud and to dismiss the whole process. Mm-hmm. Actually, there's been studies from researchers at the University of Houston showing that it was not the case, right? The distribution was quite uniform.
I've seen a lot of back and forth among academics on that election in particular. We're nearly to the end of our time here, and I wanted to bring up one potential elephant in the room that we haven't addressed very explicitly, but is definitely coming up in some of the questions we're receiving from the audience. And it relates to the sort of utility of focusing on reforms in elections when one of the political parties is refusing to abide by democratic rules and norms and is really going hard in the direction of authoritarianism. This and other trends that are really more related to democratic backsliding more than they are related to election security are of great interest to many of us, to me. And it is perhaps a good closing thought to think about lessons that the US can learn from the rest of the world, not just about getting election procedures right, but also the ways in which at the same time, there's a need to focus on what can be done to combat this problem associated with a major political party and or large swaths of voters just themselves no longer caring that much about democratic elections or democracy. Because if you get the procedures right and that other phenomenon's going on, it's hard to think that the procedures and getting the procedural aspects right are going to save us. So I wanted to close with that somewhat depressing, but I think very important thought. And please join me in thanking our panelists and thanking Janet Napolitano for bringing us all together, as well as the staff and at SIGA who ran all of this. Thank you.
And Susan, I want to thank the panelists too. This was great, that fascinating discussion. I appreciate all of your participation, and some of the questions raised and issues discussed feed very well into the workshop that the panel begins at 1 o'clock, and the following one that begins at 3. So stay tuned. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.